This is an aerial view of Coleraine, Northern Ireland, where I grew up. So I lived here until 1986 when, at the age of 10, I moved to Canada with my family. So Coleraine is situated near the north coast of Ireland at the mouth of the River Bann, which you can see runs up the middle of the town here. So there's about 25,000 people in Coleraine, and it's about an hour's drive from the capital city of Belfast. So as you can see, the area around the town is quite lush and green, lots of farmland. So for my taste of home video, I'm going to talk about the scone. So what is a scone? Well, it's a kind of quick bread. By quick bread, I mean a kind of bread made with a leavening agent like baking powder or baking soda. And it's always baked in an oven, usually on a flat tray of some kind. Now, they're usually round, but sometimes you can find them more triangular in shape. And they can be sweet or savory. There's a great deal of variation when it comes to scones, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But basically, that's what I mean by scone. Now, before I go any further, there's one thing we need to clear up, and it concerns how we say the word scone. Now, there's two ways to pronounce it. It can be pronounced scone or scone. Now, in our class, we look at the variety of Englishes spoken around the world, and we take a look at regional dialects, noting how words and vocabulary can vary greatly from place to place, even within, a small geographical area. Now, in the British Isles, how you pronounce this word depends largely upon where you live. This map was produced by Cambridge University in 2019, and it shows the regional variation and how this word is pronounced. As you can see on this map, in Northern Ireland and for most of Scotland, it's pronounced scone. Now, there's a strong showing of the the version scone in the south and west of Ireland, also in the British Midlands and around the Thames estuary. You can see it's usually pronounced scone there. Now, there was a funny little poem published in Punch in 1913 that captures this difference, and it goes like this: I ask the maid in dulcet tone to order me a buttered scone. The silly girl has been and gone and ordered me a buttered scone. So, scone, scone, it doesn't matter. Let's continue. Now, just very, very briefly, I'm going to take a quick look at the history of the scone. So, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the first recorded use of the word scone was in 1513. Although, there's some evidence that what we now call the scone has been around for much longer than that. Now, the origin of the word is unclear. There may be a Scottish origin, or it may have come to us from the Dutch word. That's not clear, so we still don't really know. What we do know is there are similar versions of the scone to be found all over Europe and beyond Europe, right? So, this is a very, very basic kind of dish. There aren't many ingredients, so it pops up all over the world. But the version of quick bread that we're talking about today, although, the origins do date back, 500 or 600 years, the sort of version that we would have today, really only dates to the advent of, the commercial availability of baking soda and baking powder. So we're talking really about 200 years that what we would recognize today as a scone has been enjoyed all over the British Isles. Now, the scone as we know it today has a strong association with a kind of English tradition of what we would call high tea or cream tea. And by the 1830s, 1840s, this is recorded as being sort of the part of daily life of people, especially in the upper classes. That said, though, there are lots of there's lots of evidence that a very similar type of afternoon snack, with tea and some kind of cake or pastry, was popular all across the continent before the 18th century. But what we're talking about today, tea and scones, was really popularized in the 1830s, 1840s. And here's this painting here kind of captures the essence of this. So why did I choose the scone for my taste of home? Well, there are a few reasons. For me, they evoke, childhood. I don't even have to taste them. Just the smell of them coming out of the oven transports me back. So what the Madeleine was for young Proust, scones transport me back to childhood. I often associate them with having afternoon tea, with family or friends, perhaps on a sunny day sitting in the garden, or, a rainy afternoon inside. Since they're so quick and easy to make, I think people make them all the time. So, whether it's a special occasion or just an afternoon snack, I think for many people in the British Isles, they'll associate them with, happy times like I do. And finally, after moving to Canada, there wasn't a great cultural adjustment to be made. There were lots of little things, but in Canada, scones were a little different. And at the time, you couldn't get anything quite right from home, in the supermarket or something. So, if we're ever feeling a little bit homesick, my mom could make up a batch of scones and all was right with the world. Okay, so I'm going to show you how I make my scones. Now, the first thing I should mention is the recipe I'm using comes to me from my mother. Now, I have a book here where I've been gathering up all my family recipes for many years. I think I've had this for more than 20 years. And I've got all kinds of things in here, all my favorite family recipes from my mother, from my grandmother's. Now I've started to add recipes from my wife's family, so there's all kinds of wonderful Russian dishes in here as well. Anyway, I love the idea of, passing on family recipes through the generations, and I hope someday to pass this along to my daughter Lily. So I strongly recommend getting a book and gathering up all your family recipes. Now, the recipe I'm using today for scones is a very basic one. If you look this up, you'll see many variations for scones, but the one I'm using is absolutely basic, right? Just plain scones. So to make scones, the ingredients you will need are some flour, so 2 1/4 cups of all-purpose flour, 2 tablespoons of granulated sugar, 2 1/2 teaspoons of baking powder, half a teaspoon of baking soda, half a cup of cold butter. So here's my butter, and you'll see that I've cut it into little cubes, which will make it much easier to work with in a minute. But I've kept the butter nice and cold. A cup of buttermilk. You can use regular milk, but buttermilk makes it a little nicer. And just 1 large egg, and just lightly whisk it. We'll use that at the very end. So to save a little time, I have already measured out all the dry ingredients, and I put them into my little sieve here. So I'm going to sieve them into my mixing bowl and just make sure there's no little lumps of anything. So pretty good. I'll just set that aside. And now we're ready to start mixing up the dough. Okay, so I've mixed my dry ingredients here. I'm just going to give them a little stir here with a whisk to get them nice and mixed up. Okay, that should just about do it. Now I'm going to add the butter. So here are my little cubes of butter that I'm going to just drop in and start mixing by hand. Okay, so now I'm ready to add the buttermilk. So 1 cup of buttermilk. Now, a good tip is just to use a fork to sort of start working this in a little bit. And squeezing out the last little lumps of butter and mixing in the milk. Okay, that's it for the dough. Now, next I'm going to take a little flour and just lightly dust the counter here with a little bit of flour because I'm going to knead the dough. So that should be about right. I'll lightly flour my hands and empty my dough here. Okay. Now, when it comes to kneading this dough, you can over knead it. There's such a thing. So you just want to do this about 10 times, right? So I'm just going to lightly turn this dough 10 times. Now, before you cut these out, you want to kind of lightly pat it down so that the dough is just about 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter thick, right? So I'm just going to lightly use this rolling pin just to save a little time. So I'm just going to roll it out until it's about 1 centimeter thick. And I think that's about it there. Okay, so I'm going to cut these out now. I've got my little scone cutter. Now, a little tip I've learned, when you make these, you can kind of make a mess if they stick too much. So if you dip your little cutter in flour after each one, they won't stick. So let's get my baking tray. And now I'm going to cut these. So that looks about right there. Okay, you'll see I've kind of run out of space, so to use this extra dough, I can just lightly knead it again and roll it out once again to 1 centimeter thickness and start over. Okay. Okay, so I've got my 20 small scones here on my lightly floured baking sheet. Now the last step before we put them in the oven, you remember earlier I mentioned an egg. So I've lightly whipped this egg and I'm just going to put a little dab of egg on top of each scone, and that way they'll have a nice sort of golden brown color when they come out of the oven. So okay, so here's what we have, our 20 little scones ready for the oven. So once again, they're going into a preheated oven at 425 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'll put them in on the middle rack. Okay, time to put the kettle on. Okay, so 15 minutes later, and the scones are out of the oven. They are a beautiful light golden color. They smell delicious. So I'm just going to let them cool for a few minutes, make some tea, and we'll taste them.
Delicious, even better than mine, Jonathan.